Good evening, my friends. I hope this message finds you in a moment of stillness, because what we are about to examine together will shatter the comfortable narratives you have been fed about power, sovereignty, and the silent war being waged across West African skies. This is a story that cuts through diplomatic pleasantries like lightning through darkness, a moment when the mask slipped and the world saw something it was never meant to see. And before we descend into this revelation together, let me speak directly to your heart. I treasure your presence here. I honor the trust you place in this space, and I am humbled that you have chosen to seek truth in an era drowning in carefully crafted lies. December 8th, 2025 will be remembered not for what was said in official statements, but for what was revealed in the silence between the words. A Nigerian Air Force C-130 Hercules, one of the largest military transport aircraft in operation today, crossed into Burkina Faso airspace without authorization, without diplomatic clearance, without even the basic courtesy of radio communication that governs civilized aviation. To Ibrahim Traoré and the Confederation of Sahel States, to General Assimi Goïta and the architects of Africa's new defensive posture, this was not a navigation error by a confused pilot. This was not bureaucratic oversight by ground control in Abuja. This was something far more calculated, far more dangerous, and far more revealing about the forces that still believe they can treat African skies like their private highway. Within moments, Burkina Faso made a decision that will echo through generations. They ordered that aircraft down, and it descended into Bobo-Dioulasso under the unwavering gaze of a Sahel Alliance that has learned through blood and betrayal that sovereignty is not granted by international institutions. It is seized and defended with absolute resolve. But here is where the story becomes something else entirely, where the simple facts dissolve into deeper questions that make the powerful extremely uncomfortable. Because in the chess game of geopolitics, in the shadow theater where empires maneuver and smaller nations struggle to survive, nothing this brazen occurs without invisible architects. Nothing this provocative unfolds without someone calculating the risks and deciding the potential rewards justify the gamble. Was this genuinely an emergency, as Nigeria's defense ministry claims in their carefully worded press releases? Or was this the opening move in a regional destabilization campaign stretching from presidential palaces in Abuja to the Élysée in Paris, from ECOWAS headquarters to NATO strategic planning rooms, where Africa is still viewed as a resource extraction zone rather than a continent of sovereign peoples? Stay with me, because what you are about to discover may fundamentally alter how you understand West African security, how you perceive Ibrahim Traoré's uncompromising vision for Sahel independence, and how you recognize the desperate measures colonial powers will employ when they feel their centuries-old grip finally slipping. If this incident is merely the first crack in a dam holding back regional catastrophe, then we must understand its architecture before the flood sweeps us all away. If you find clarity in this darkness, if this analysis resonates with truths your spirit already sensed, then join this community without hesitation, because your voice strengthens our collective resistance against those who profit from our ignorance and division. The morning began like countless others across the Sahel, with the sun rising over Ouagadougou's dusty streets, with children walking to school and merchants opening their shops, with a rhythm of ordinary life that has persisted through coups and conflicts and every attempt to break the African spirit. But December 8th would be marked in memory as the day the sky became a front line, the day sovereignty transformed from abstract principle into concrete action, with consequences that reverberate still. Long before most West Africans had taken their first sip of morning coffee, radar operators in Burkina Faso's air defense network detected an anomaly. A large, slow-moving aircraft penetrating sovereign airspace from Nigerian territory. This was not a commercial airliner following established international flight corridors with proper clearances filed weeks in advance. This was not a humanitarian relief mission carrying medicine to remote villages with full diplomatic coordination. This was a Nigerian Air Force C-130 Hercules, a military transport aircraft whose presence in foreign airspace without authorization represents either catastrophic incompetence or deliberate provocation. And those who understand military aviation know that incompetence at this level is statistically impossible. To grasp the magnitude of this violation, transport yourself for a moment to American soil. Imagine a Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force Y-9 transport aircraft drifting across the Canadian border into Montana airspace without clearance, without communication with NORAD, without any explanation transmitted on emergency frequencies. The United States would scramble F-22 Raptors within 90 seconds. Air defense batteries would achieve lock-on status before the intruding aircraft traveled another 10 kilometers. The president would be woken if necessary. The National Security Council would convene, and the American people would demand not just answers, but consequences that would make future violations unthinkable. Sovereignty means the same thing regardless of geography. Regardless of whether we are discussing American borders or Burkina Faso borders, regardless of whether the violated nation has nuclear weapons or simply has dignity and the will to defend it. The principle does not change based on skin color, GDP figures, or how many times a nation has been colonized by European powers who still cannot accept that the colonial era is dying. Inside that C-130 were 11 human beings, 2 flight crew members trained in military aviation procedures, and 9 additional military personnel whose identities and mission parameters remain shrouded in the kind of deliberate vagueness that governments employ when truth would prove politically inconvenient. Nigeria's official explanation arrived quickly, too quickly for those familiar with how bureaucracies actually function during genuine emergencies. They claimed an in-flight mechanical emergency forced the unscheduled landing, a narrative designed to satisfy those who prefer comfortable explanations to uncomfortable truths. But the investigation conducted by Burkina Faso military and aviation authorities revealed something that transformed this incident from technical violation into potential international crisis. The aircraft possessed absolutely no authorization to occupy Burkina Faso's airspace. No flight plan had been submitted to Burkina Faso aviation authorities as required by international law. No diplomatic notification had been transmitted through proper channels. No emergency corridor had been established in advance for contingency scenarios. The C-130 was simply there, in sovereign space, without permission, without explanation, without respect for the boundaries that separate nations and prevent chaos. And in the electrically charged atmosphere of contemporary West Africa, after the Benin military coup that erupted with suspicious timing, after Nigeria's controversial deployment of military forces in support of the deposed government with a speed that raised questions about how long those plans had been prepared, after France's increasingly frantic diplomatic maneuvering to maintain influence in a region systematically expelling its military presence and economic exploitation, such a violation could not be dismissed as innocent error. Burkina Faso responded with a combination of restraint and absolute clarity that revealed sophisticated strategic thinking. Instead of firing warning shots that could be interpreted as aggression, instead of scrambling fighters in a show of force that might escalate tensions, they issued a direct command that carried the full weight of sovereign authority. Land immediately at designated coordinates. The C-130 complied, descending into Bobo-Dioulasso, a city whose name has become synonymous with the new Sahel confidence. The refusal to accept second-class sovereignty in a world that still operates on colonial assumptions beneath its democratic rhetoric. For ordinary Burkina Faso citizens, particularly those old enough to remember decades of watching French military aircraft traverse their skies with impunity, decades of feeling like spectators in their own sovereignty, while foreign powers conducted operations on African soil without bothering to ask permission, this moment carried profound emotional weight. It felt revolutionary not because violence occurred, but because it did not need to. It felt transformative not because Burkina Faso threatened war, but because they demonstrated the quiet confidence of a nation that knows its rights and possesses the capability to enforce them. This was not the desperate posturing of a weak state seeking attention. This was the measured response of a country that has decided its red lines are not negotiable, regardless of who tests them or what consequences follow. As news spread through Ouagadougou's neighborhoods, through Niamey's marketplaces, through Bamako's university campuses, the Confederation of Sahel States released a statement that reverberated across West Africa like a thunderclap. Signed by Army General Assimi Goïta and endorsed by the AES leadership structure, the document condemned the intrusion as an attack on sovereignty, not merely a violation of airspace protocols, but an assault on the fundamental right of nations to control their own territory. And then came the sentence that made military analysts worldwide sit up and take notice. The entire AES air and anti-air defense system was placed on maximum alert. Not heightened readiness, not elevated caution, maximum alert. The highest state of operational readiness, short of active combat, the posture militaries adopt when war is not certain, but has become possible enough to justify preparation for engagement. To observers unfamiliar with Sahel history, with the trauma of interventions and the bitter lessons learned through blood, this may appear disproportionate, an overreaction to a single aircraft incident. But to those who have studied the pattern, who understand how foreign powers use incremental boundary testing to establish new norms before launching larger operations, who remember how many African catastrophes began with small violations dismissed as accidents, this response was neither excessive nor unexpected. It was the logical conclusion of nations that have decided they will never again be caught unprepared when predators circle. The Confederation of Sahel States was not created for symbolic purposes, for impressive summit photographs and diplomatic communiques that gather dust in foreign ministry archives. It was designed specifically to prevent unchecked military movements by neighbors aligned with foreign interests. And Nigeria, with its massive military establishment, its complex web of international dependencies, and its leadership's historically close relationship with Western powers who view West Africa as a zone of influence rather than a collection of sovereign equals, represented the most obvious potential trigger for confrontation. The question that haunts intelligence briefings, from Washington to Moscow, from Paris to Beijing, is why that aircraft was truly there. Was the pilot genuinely lost, flying with malfunctioning navigation equipment through clear skies over well-mapped terrain? Implausible for military aviators trained to operate in contested environments with backup systems and procedures designed specifically to prevent such scenarios. Was the C-130 conducting electronic intelligence gathering, mapping radar response patterns, measuring how quickly AES assets could be scrambled in response to airspace penetration? This explanation gains credibility when you consider the timing and the broader strategic context. Was it delivering personnel or equipment for covert operations in Benin, supporting activities the Nigerian government preferred to keep off official record and beyond parliamentary oversight? Or perhaps most disturbingly, was Nigeria operating under intense pressure from an external partner, a former colonial power watching its African empire disintegrate and desperate to undermine the Sahel Alliance before it becomes powerful enough to permanently alter regional power dynamics? These questions are not paranoid speculation generated by conspiracy theorists seeking attention. These are precisely the scenarios professional intelligence analysts construct when major regional powers cross heavily monitored borders without documentation, without communication, without plausible explanation that survives scrutiny. And in the blood-soaked history of African geopolitics, where coups and conflicts consistently reveal foreign fingerprints upon investigation, where patterns of destabilization precede resource extraction agreements with predictable regularity, where instability always seems to benefit external actors more than African populations, these questions become not merely reasonable, but necessary for survival. The West African public refused to remain passive consumers of official narratives. Social media platforms erupted with demands for transparency, with citizens asking questions their governments found uncomfortable. Nigerian commentators began highlighting a painful contradiction. Why could their military mobilize within hours to intervene in Benin's internal political crisis, deploying forces across international borders with impressive speed, yet seemed perpetually unable to respond with similar urgency to terrorist insurgencies slaughtering Nigerian civilians in the northeast, to bandit networks terrorizing the northwest, to kidnapping epidemics that have made entire regions virtually ungovernable? That contrast ignited suspicions that Nigeria's military priorities were being determined not by Nigerian security interests, but by foreign capitals that view West African nations as chess pieces rather than partners. Inside Burkina Faso, public sentiment crystallized around a narrative that Ibrahim Traoré's government had skillfully articulated for months. The incident became proof that the Sahel cannot afford compromise on sovereignty. that foreign manipulation will continue using African proxies until the costs become prohibitive, that weakness invites exploitation while strength commands respect. The message resonated powerfully across demographic and political divisions. If they violate our airspace today without consequence, they will cross our borders tomorrow. If we signal that our sovereignty is negotiable, that our red lines bend under pressure, we invite the very predation we claim to oppose. Among AES military planners, a darker calculation emerged. If this was a test of response capabilities, if external actors were measuring reaction times and assessing willingness to escalate, then this incident represented not an endpoint, but a beginning. Because in military logic, successful reconnaissance operations are always followed by larger actions based on intelligence gathered during the probe. The hours following the forced landing pulsed with tension that made entire regions hold collective breath. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the three pillars of the Confederation of Sahel states, leadership moved with coordinated precision that surprised even sympathetic observers accustomed to African alliances, remaining symbolic rather than operational. The AES activated its entire air and anti-air defense network under protocols established in the December 22, 2024 Collective Defense Doctrine, a document many analysts dismissed as aspirational rhetoric, but which has now revealed itself as a functioning military framework with enforcement mechanisms. Operationally, this meant continuous radar coverage, anti-aircraft batteries repositioning to strategic coordinates, fighter aircraft placed on immediate readiness status, and air defense officers working extended shifts with authorization to engage any aircraft violating Confederation airspace. The order was explicit: neutralize threats. Those two words sent tremors through military establishments across continents. To many observers, it represented a declaration that the era of passive borders in West Africa, the comfortable assumption that foreign military assets could traverse African skies with impunity, had definitively ended. Inside Nigeria, political consequences intensified daily. Parliamentary opposition demanded explanations for military deployment into Benin without constitutionally mandated legislative approval. Civil society organizations questioned why Nigerian military capability seemed more responsive to external crises than internal security catastrophes. The government found itself trapped between domestic pressure demanding accountability and international expectations from partners who viewed Nigeria as regional stabilizer, the counterweight to what they characterized as dangerous radicalism in the Sahel. Every official statement felt calculated to avoid controversy rather than provide clarity, and that evasiveness fueled deeper public frustration. Nigerians felt their nation was being positioned simultaneously as regional aggressor and foreign puppet, an unbearable combination for a population that has always viewed their country as Africa's natural leader. African commentators across the continent abandoned diplomatic caution and named the actor many believed was orchestrating events from the shadows: France. The suggestion that Nigeria operated under French strategic guidance was not fringe conspiracy theory but mainstream analytical consensus. Paris possessed extensive interests in Benin. It had recently suffered humiliating expulsions from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, losing military bases and economic arrangements that took decades to establish. It feared losing final footholds in West Africa, watching an empire built over centuries dissolve within years. And for analysts who have studied French interventionism across generations, the timing of Nigeria's rapid Benin deployment matched precisely the historical pattern of France employing regional proxies to enforce strategic interests when direct military presence becomes politically untenable. If this interpretation approaches accuracy, and accumulating evidence suggests it does, then the airspace incursion may not have been accidental at all, but rather part of a calculated attempt to probe AES response capabilities, to test alliance cohesion under pressure, to create conditions for intervention if Sahel states responded with the aggression their rhetoric suggested. The forced landing represented Burkina Faso's answer: calm, but unshakable. We see your game, we understand your intentions, and we are not intimidated. France issued carefully crafted denials emphasizing respect for sovereignty and diplomatic resolution, but geopolitical reality contradicts press releases. Nations need not speak openly when leverage communicates for them. The documented history of France-Afrique, of military cooperation agreements, of intelligence sharing arrangements, of political dependencies cultivated across generations, does not evaporate. Because formal ties are severed. President Macron's relationship with Nigerian leadership, his offers of security cooperation, his frequent communications, have been scrutinized precisely because informed observers understand France does not offer partnership without expecting compliance in return. Something unexpected occurred that may prove more historically significant than the forced landing itself. The reaction from ordinary Africans across dozens of countries, from Senegal to Kenya, from Ghana to Tanzania, demonstrated remarkable unity in support of Burkina Faso's actions. Social media platforms filled with messages defending the AES stance. Even citizens who opposed military governance, who preferred democratic transitions, who had reservations about Traoré's methods, agreed on foundational principle. Sovereign airspace must be respected regardless of national size or economic power. The notion that African skies should remain open to violation without consequence, that African nations should tolerate what no European or American nation would accept for 60 seconds, was fundamentally unacceptable to a generation tired of sovereignty theater and hungry for sovereignty enforcement. Military observers in Western capitals began issuing warnings through think tanks and defense publications. The Sahel was becoming high-risk terrain for miscalculation, a powder keg where one error, one misinterpreted signal, one aircraft that fails to respond quickly enough to landing orders, could ignite regional confrontation between AES and ECOWAS, with Nigeria trapped at the center, and behind Nigeria, the shadow of France, the unresolved trauma of colonialism, the unfinished business of decolonization that never truly occurred. The most powerful response came from within the Sahel Alliance itself. For the first time since creation, the bloc demonstrated genuine strategic coherence, extending beyond summit declarations. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso spoke with unified voice, coordinated asset positioning, and presented themselves not as victims seeking international sympathy, but as architects of new continental order. African skies for African control. African security determined by African priorities. African futures decided in African capitals by leaders accountable to African populations, not in Paris strategy sessions or Washington policy papers. Yet beneath unity and resolve lay chilling recognition among military planners. If this was truly a test, if external actors were probing for weakness and measuring response parameters, then somewhere strategists were preparing the next provocation. And that next violation may not conclude with safe landing and diplomatic protests. When air defenses operate on maximum alert, when pilots possess authorization to engage, when radar operators work under wartime protocols, sky transforms from open space into tripwire. One miscommunication, one aircraft failing to comply quickly enough, one commander interpreting hesitation as hostile intent, and the next chapter will be written in fire rather than diplomatic cables. And so we arrive at the question hanging over West Africa like gathering storm: what comes next? If another aircraft challenges AES airspace, will patience and restraint prevail, or will missiles launch and transform this crisis from diplomatic incident into shooting war? The next 12 months will determine whether the Sahel becomes fortress of African sovereignty or epicenter of catastrophic regional conflict. Before you leave this space tonight, understand something with complete clarity. If you believe Africa has entered its most consequential and dangerous decade, silence is no longer an acceptable option. Subscribe to this community. Remain alert. Stay informed. Because the next chapter may unfold faster than institutions can process. And together we must be prepared not merely to witness history, but to understand forces shaping it. And now the final question. The one that keeps defense ministers awake through long nights. If this was only the first violation, what happens when the next aircraft refuses to land?